If Satan has a home, it's San Francisco because it was the founding center for the Church of Satan under Anton LaVey. This is him giving a chalice of blood to Jane Mansfield, who later on ran for president on the satanic ticket. He also was very much in connection with Marilyn Monroe, who knew better than to have a photograph ever taken of herself. But he was quite notorious. He went to City College of San Francisco, where he majored in criminology. I also went to City College of San Francisco, where I majored in criminology. And his history at City College of San Francisco was quite well known. And so his Church of Satan was established on the Walpurgisnacht of 1966, the year I was born, just a few days before I was born on October 20th. This young man is Colonel Michael Aquino. He would be a lieutenant colonel during all of the years that I worked with him. This is a very poor photograph, but it's one of the few photographs from a newspaper clipping that I could find of him when he was a young man, serving his years in Vietnam. He served his time in Vietnam often dressed like that, as a satanic chaplain. And what he would tell the troops was, you don't call on God. In our case, you need to call on Satan. And one of the reasons for this was because there was an enormous change that was going on in the entire officer corps in Vietnam. This is where he served. He served in 3 CTZ. This is the 3rd combat zone of Vietnam. It's the South Vietnam. Would you see that title at the top? The section right below it is where he served. He served there for a year with the 6th Psi Ops Battalion, 3-Corps Tactical Zone. He was dealing in field experiments with amplified sound to disorient the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese. And what they were doing was broadcasting demonic screams from the helicopters that were flying overhead. Well, those helicopters kept getting shot down by RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades. So they were having an enormous loss because the helicopters are clearly visible. They're broadcasting enormous sound. They're attracting all the attention in the world to themselves. They're nothing but flying targets. The Vietnamese were taking them down, and their rule of thumb was literally, if the helicopter is bigger than your thumb, you can hit it with an RPG. That's how easy it was for them. So his solution to it was to get the demonic screams to go over the heads of the VC and the North Vietnamese army and disorient them without the helicopters. Towards that end, he wrote what was known as the Diabolicon. The Diabolicon was taken so seriously by the Vietnamese that they actually raided his headquarters multiple times and lost hundreds of men to destroy it. There were several times during his service in Vietnam that it was more than half destroyed by enemy fire. The Diabolicon was a series of quatrains, poetic prose statements that were channeled through Lieutenant Colonel Aquino through 7 demonic entities. He lists them as the actual authors of the book. They are, as he lists them, Satan, Beelzebub, Azazel, Abaddon, Asmodeus, Azathoth. Astaroth would be a variant on that. Belial, Leviathan. This is what led to his being accepted into the Church of Satan as a high priest by Anton LaVey when he came home. He returned in the summer solstice, June 1970. He was the advisor for a grade Z horror film called The Asylum of Satan. So that's one of the few trash horror flicks that you can rent that has a grade A ritual text. All of the rituals in that film are designed to work. So please be careful when you're looking at that DVD. So I give this advice out, don't let your children watch it. And I'm serious with this. This is nothing to play with. I have seen magic work. It is simply a technique, a kind of alternate technology, if you will, that works with a different level of physics. This is Anton LaVey, the young Anton LaVey, and the founder of the Church of Satan with one of their great converts, Sammy Davis Jr. This is San Francisco with the San Francisco Presidio military base. So this is El Presidio Rio de San Francisco, 1,500 acres of land that was stolen from the American Indians. It was a Native American Indian tribal resting ground of the Ohlone, First Peoples Nation. It was originally stolen by the Spanish. It was a captaincy of the Spanish in 1776. So it's one of the oldest establishments in the United States, as old as anything on the East Coast. Later on, of course, it was the Area 51 of the United States during the World War I era. We're talking about maritime biplanes being launched off a little spit of sand known as Crissy Field, but they had the entire U.S. 6th Army stationed on base to protect them. So they were testing top secret planes. This is why later on Roswell documents were sent to the Presidio military base. The historical connection of aviation was still there. This is the Presidio itself. It's very difficult to see this, but if you look at other maps of Presidio, you will ultimately be able to locate many of the facilities of which I speak. The child daycare center will, of course, play prominently. The library where I worked at. Basically, you'll be dealing with kind of a tour guide for yourself because it's an open base now. And you're free to visit these places and kind of absorb the energy, if you will, see what you can feel, see what kind of investigations you can dig up. Because one thing I can assure you, when the child molestation came down at the city of San Francisco, where 500 kids, half a thousand kids were infested with AIDS, I was given direct orders to destroy maps of the underground tunnels that led from one facility to another. We're talking about ancient artillery batteries, if you can use the term ancient, a couple hundred years old, that got expanded and modernized into the World War II era. They were connected by underground tunnels to avoid blast. They were reinforced with lead later on to avoid atomic blast. And so we're talking about massive labyrinth exists beneath Presidio that connects one building to another. There are no maps to that labyrinth. I was given direct orders to destroy them all. This is Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. He broke away from the Church of Satan because the Church of Satan was far more into a kind of hedonism, a worship of the self. What Aquino had found through the powers that he had garnished was that he was in connection with far darker sources. So what he had done was he had actually conducted what is known as a prerogative invocation. An evocation is the summoning of an entity. An invocation would be intimate communication with the entity. He felt that he had summoned Satan himself under the guise of one of his original avatars, Set, or the Egyptian god of darkness. Hence the name Temple of Set, which is the name of his temple, which is still alive and well today and expanding internationally. His wife is beside him. Her name is Lilith. Behind them is an image of their god Set, or what we would know of as Satan. These are various ancient alphabets. This is a modern book, but these alphabets are derived from ancient manuscripts. One of the things I was assigned to as a military-based librarian as liaison to Colonel Aquino was to use the OCLC, the Online Cataloging and Library Cooperation Program, to find Lieutenant Colonel Aquino ancient grimoires from museums all over the United States or in the Commonwealth, and use this program to get direct orders to our Commonwealth allies, such as Canada or England, or to anywhere within the nation, saying that these grimoires were vital to national security and had to be utilized by the Defense Intelligence Agency. So as a librarian, I had to order these grimoires for him, make sure they arrived safely, because they are literally in refrigerated safes. And I would hold these moldering tomes in my hand, confirm them, make sure that they got to Lieutenant Aquino, and he had to conduct his rituals within the library itself, because they could not leave the library. Absolutely could they not leave the library. So he invited his coven, and I never saw a member of his 12-member coven. He was number 13. Never saw a member who was beneath the rank of major. He very much had only high-level military officers working with him in the new science. This is the Letterman Army Medical Center. Now, I myself had to go to Letterman Army Medical Center many times as a military dependent. 25% of all Army doctors were trained at Letterman Army Medical Center. So it was an enormous establishment. It is the first Army hospital, believe it or not, that ever existed in the United States. Until that time, what the U.S. had were field hospitals. They did not have structured Army hospitals throughout the Civil War. Anyone who tells you otherwise may be talking about establishments of universities that the armies would take advantage of. This was actually the U.S. Army's first major structured hospital. It no longer exists. One of the reasons they tore it down is because very gruesome experiments were performed here on both man and beast. I had to deal with the experimental subjects because many of these were people from prison. They were given shortened sentences, revoked sentences. They were given pardons, full pardons if they would volunteer for experimentation. And while they were kept at Letterman Army Medical Center, I had to deal with giving them materials to read. As a Department of Defense librarian, they were spending months and months under experimentation. Some of them would be funny. They would be given 9 months of being fed nothing but salmon. Whether they're black or they're white, their skin would turn orange. And they had nothing to do but salmon burgers, salmon tofu. These men were going mad, but at least it was funny. I'll show you some photographs later on, which didn't turn out so funny. This is Dresden, and this is one of the fascinations of Lieutenant Colonel Aquino. The lay public really does not understand a lot of occult dynamics, but what happened at the Dresden firebombing was a fireball that was so massive that more people were killed and more damage was done than Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. People might ask, what's the point of this tremendous loss of life? These are real people. These are not statues overlooking the city of Dresden. These are real people. And this is what Colonel Aquino was explaining to me. While the Americans ignored Japan, they had a Germany first policy, and they were desperately killing as many civilians as they could to summon entities by opening a portal with all of that life energy. They had to kill as many people as they could to get this portal opened. And I was saying, why were you so desperate that this needed to be done? He said, well, you don't understand. The Nazis themselves had concentration camps where they were killing millions of people so that they could summon and invoke the old gods of the Norse and the Teutonic tribes, Thor, Woden, all of the rest of these gods that you're familiar with from grade school. And I said, well, how are these gods a threat to you? And he said, mass sacrifice brings entities back. You would not believe it, but paganism would be a major religion today in Germany if we hadn't done what we had done. And I said, well, what have you accomplished? Well, we brought forth entities that we now have to control, that we now have to contain, that we now have to feed. We have to keep these wars going. This is Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons worked for NASA. Jack Parsons himself is an interesting character. He basically was born in World War I. He used to go to Devil's Gate Arroyo, and he would fire test rockets. He is the only black magician, a confirmed alchemist, who has a crater on the moon named after him, fittingly on the dark side of the moon, Crater Parsons. But after he was shooting off rockets at Devil's Gate Arroyo by day, he performed rites of sex magic and invocation as the head of the Los Angeles Agape Lodge of Aleister Crowley's OTO. Aleister Crowley, of course, is British, but the OTO was international, Ordo Templi Orientalis. And as a member of Agape Lodge, Jack Parsons and his friends would hold nightly orgies to call up various satanic entities. One such house guest who joined them at Agape Lodge was none other than L. Ron Hubbard. And L. Ron Hubbard basically convinced Jack Parsons, who's actually there on the right of that photo, he convinced him that we had to call up the whore of Babylon and we can give birth to the Antichrist if you consummate a physical relationship with her. So with L. Ron Hubbard acting as the scryer, Parsons invoked to summon the spirit of the whore of Babylon in a major working in the Mojave Desert. This becomes important with some of the military bases where I was taken to later on in my career as his aide, where he summoned up the whore of Babylon in January 18th, 1946. A young woman named Marjorie Cameron responded, literally walking out of the desert. And it's very difficult to find any past on this woman. We know her name. We don't really know other than that. Some people might be able to find out something from the police records. I worked with a criminology department in San Francisco. I've got a degree in criminal psychology. I don't know much about her, that anything that anyone knows in terms of police records or anything else. But she wound up consummating with Jack Parsons, and while she was doing that, L. Ron Hubbard ran off with Jack Parsons' life savings and his wife. In the meantime, they gave birth to a tremendously twisted, deformed young child that died at childbirth. That much was medically confirmed. That much everyone knew. But his name was Moonchild. And years later, while I was dealing with Colonel Aquino as his aide, back in those days, before we had cell phones, before we had the internet, you used to take calls. And I used to take calls for him as a lieutenant colonel. And one of the people I had to take calls from was Moonchild. This individual at the other end of the line said, "This is Moonchild. I need to talk to Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino." And I'd say, "Well, he's busy right now. I'll go get him. I'll see if he's available." Lieutenant Colonel Aquino always answered. And I said, "Is that the Moonchild?" And he says, "Yes, that's the Moonchild." And I said, "Well, what are you doing with him?" And he says, "He's working with us on ushering in the age of the Antichrist. Someday you'll have the privilege of meeting Moonchild if you ever join me in my community." Later on, when I had to wait for about maybe a good 15 minutes for Colonel Aquino to come, I had to entertain Moonchild at the other end of the line. I never met him personally. But I asked him, "You know, there's an urban legend about the birth of Marjorie Cameron being a deformed child who died at the moment of conception." He says, "Yes, that was my twin brother. I sapped all of his energy in the womb." And I said, "Well, that's an enormous claim to make, and I want to ask him more about it," but Colonel Michael Aquino walked in and took the call after that. By 1948, Jack Parsons had lost his Navy security clearance, which meant he was out of his Caltech job. At that point, he declared himself Beleriand Armilus El Degel Antichrist, wrote the Book of the Antichrist. The following year, in 1950, he was fired from Hughes Aircraft for stealing confidential documents. In the Aerojet Israeli deal, he sold a bunch of confidential secrets to Israel, of all places. And on June 17th, 1952, he died in a mysterious mercury fulminate explosion, which Colonel Aquino claimed that he had helped to organize. And I said, "Well, that's impossible. That was years before you were born, wasn't it?" And he said, no, don't you understand? I was born on October 16th, 1946, while all of the defenders at the Nuremberg trial were being hung. He said, my kind of occultism was such that I was intuitively blessed with this kind of skill, even while I was a national commander of the Eagle Scouts. Matter of fact, that's where he met Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. Both of them were Eagle Scouts. This is Wewelsburg Castle. This is where Heinrich Himmler of the SS was trying to coordinate the ushering in of the old gods, of the Teutonic Norse gods, to come back to walk the earth once more. And this is where Lieutenant Colonel Aquino gained enormous notoriety. He was in service with the World Affairs Council due to his enormous level of security clearances, and he was put on second mint to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. October 19th to 20th, which just happens to be my birthday, in 1983, he entered the Hall of the Slain, where Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler and his SS officers were trying to coordinate the summoning through the sacrifice of millions of lives at Auschwitz, Dachau, various other concentration camps, and bring back the elderly gods of the Norse mythology. Michael Aquino entered there as a NATO officer and pulled rank, commandeered the place, basically hijacked it, conducted an enormously obscene ritual of supposition and binding in which he was trying to prevent the gods from ever breaking through. He felt that the magic the Nazis had was so strong that the gods would eventually break through. It was this kind of threat that Colonel Aquino never wanted discovered. He wanted it hidden. He got on national TV and was talking about the threat of it, and people couldn't even understand what he was saying because of their lack of education in occult matters. Usually he got branded as a neo-Nazi. But in terms of all of this, in no way, shape, or form am I commending him or making him the hero. I'm simply showing there are other sides. There are other magics. There are other reality filters. And depending on which reality filter you use, it depends on what kind of science develops. This is Fort Irwin. Fort Irwin is out in the middle of nowhere. Fort Irwin is the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert between Nevada and California. It's as big as Rhode Island in terms of landmass. And I will guarantee you one thing, all credit to the Army. Where I experienced Desert Shield, Desert Storm, our training in the deserts, I wasn't with the Army, I was a Marine, but our training as a nation in that desert is what led to a 44-day victory on the ground, thanks to what was done at Fort Irwin. There is no denying the conventional common sense of training for desert warfare in a condition that is in many ways worse than what was confronted in Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, this is where Jack Parsons used to conduct his rituals. So this is where our colonel brought me several times when he was trying to convert me for reasons that I will eventually go into. Now, there was someone else he worked with, one of a series of communication satellites launched by NASA in the 1960s. Each spent several years in low Earth orbit and would have looked to the naked eye like a bright, moving star. This was known in Army circles as Project Lucifer, son of the morning star. Our friend Colonel Aquino pushed it through a kind of high-grade moron by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon was in Vietnam for 5 months. He was the only platoon leader in a battalion left alive after 5 months. And this goes to why there are so many Satanists in the military. People ask, well, how could this happen? We're a Christian nation. What happened to all these good old boys, the salt of the earth from World War II? Well, they got fragged. Frag is a term for men who kill their officers. Now, during the time of the Vietnam War, we had an enormous stress. As a Marine, I can tell you that statistically, even though you were drafted, and you could be drafted into the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, a lot of people don't know that you would spend 3 months in training, you'd go for 9 months, like childbirth, to Vietnam. And during that period of time, helicopters would fly you every day from battle zone to battle zone. So in 9 months' time, your Marine would see more combat than a U.S. Marine would see in 5 years of World War II. Statistically, that's accurate. This is why men were breaking in Vietnam. You get the World War II generation, and they're saying, we're the greatest generation. We fought a real war. They're talking about like, oh, I was at Iwo. These battles were massive. They were tremendous. There's no denying the valor of the Marine Corps. But you would have months and months while they're preparing for the next invasion. These islands were not close to each other. And during that off time, Marines got to relax. They got a time to recover. That did not exist in Vietnam. Every day you were in combat. This is why they all came home, Army, Vietnam, or other services, so altered, so changed, so susceptible to what Colonel Aquino had to say. And what about their officers, the men who were to lead them? Well, Long Binh Jail, LBJ is what everyone called it in South Vietnam. LBJ, Long Binh Jail, was site of the largest race riots in American prison history. That's right, the largest race riots in American prison history did not take place in the United States. They took place at LBJ in Vietnam. And who was in most of those prisons and military brig? Men who fragged their officers. How many officers were fragged? 20,000. Vietnam was the most dangerous war in the history of mankind for an officer. And anyone who doubts that, let me put it into perspective for you. 1968, you had 600,000 men, well over 500,000 men in Vietnam. You multiply them by the length of the war, even if you're very conservative, 11 years, say you take a few years away, you're left with around 10 million men serving in Vietnam. And for a fact, I know it was higher than that, more like 12 to 13 million. 20,000 men dead out of that, it's a very small percentage of men. But in terms of officers, that's a lot. And in terms of what happened socially in terms of that, what did you see? You saw a lot of these Christian officers go by the wayside and new men filled their place. Men appointed by men like Aquino, men like Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon, a guy whose father went to West Point, but he flunked his appointment because he couldn't pass the English exam. But he majored in art in ROTC. So what was he? He was Colonel Aquino's battering ram. Whereas Colonel Aquino could appear on national TV dressed as a priest of the Temple of Set, and he could go around in full uniform on duty with his face clipped, eyebrows clipped, the 666 tattooed on his scalp. He did have that. He could wear the widow's peak, all the rest of that. Freedom of religion, that's what the Constitution protects. But he couldn't appear on air in uniform. Channon could, and Channon did, supporting the Church of Satan, at later Temple of Set, and later the Wicca Battalion, known as 1st Earth Battalion. And 1st Earth Battalion, thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon's stationing in Fort Lewis near Seattle, where high technology test beds were being developed, he was able to get assigned to the unit designated to test new equipment and ideas developed by Task Force Delta. What is Task Force Delta? Task Force Delta is the Army think tank of officers, futurists, psychologists that study critical personnel problems. Because in 1979, after the Vietnam War, that's exactly what you had. Enormous personnel problems. Nobody was going to sign up for the Army. So they said, well, what do we do? Well, let's get all these specialists together in Task Force Delta. By the way, I need to emphasize, I can't overemphasize this strongly enough, this is not to be confused with Delta Force. Delta Force is a group of honorable men who were disastrously misdeployed in the desert in an attempt to rescue the American hostages by Jimmy Carter. I can guarantee you they were sabotaged. There is no way on earth that you have helicopters crash into each other, fall out of the sky in totality as they did with Delta Force. And that unit was almost wiped out thanks to that kind of sabotage. And the sabotage behind that is a totally different story, has nothing to do with Satanism, more to deal with CIA intervention, and ultimately Reagan becoming president. Nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I don't want Delta Force confused with Task Force Delta. But Task Force Delta is an official Army unit. They're an enormous organization. They utilize DeltaNet, the official Army computer network, the official designator of the U.S. Army Delta Force Computer Conference and Electrical Mail Network, has over 1,000 members. That was back when I worked at DOD. And they call themselves the Tribe. This was a very, very sinister term that I was going to learn later on had to deal with child trafficking. The Tribe always referred to a kind of inversion of the tribes of Israel. And they called themselves the 13th tribe, or the Lost Tribe, was how they would refer to themselves as. James Channon, who I mentioned, who's part of this, got lent out officially to at least a dozen government agencies during the time that I had to work with Aquino. This included the LAPD. This included the Seattle Police Department. And he got there so he could proselytize 1st Earth Battalion concepts on TV and national radio as well in full uniform. At the charter initiation of the 1st Earth Battalion of Wicca, or Warlocks, this was at the second quarterly meeting of Task Force Delta in 1980, at the U.S. Army War College Officers Club at Fort Leavenworth. They conducted their initiation ritual around a candle and, fittingly, a dollar bill. At any rate, they incorporated as a monastery in Santa Fe, New Mexico, private and nonprofit, so that the Army could have plausible deniability. Both West Point And the Command and Staff College, they include the 1st Earth Battalion curricula in their human relations courses. This is a lot is what happened to the Army, is you get this kind of human relations for the Army. I've got an actual official Army manual at home that is sold at any post exchange in the United States called Military Operations Other Than War. Now, what on earth would a military exist for other than war? Well, there's Meals on Wheels programs to other ethnic groups. There's all these kinds of very bizarre social programs where they become social engineers. You can thank 1st Earth Battalion for that. If your Army has stopped killing things and breaking people and demolishing buildings and has become this kind of like diplomats in uniform and Meals on Wheels services and meal drop services the world over, you can thank a lot of the 1st Earth Battalion reconstruction for that. In terms of the officers in the network, at the time that I worked with the Department of Defense, there were over 800. They distributed all of these materials via the chain of the command. There were 2 4-star generals that I know of. One of them was General Bob Shoemaker. He called Jim Channon the Army's leading futurist and the 1st Earth Battalion warrior monk, satanic warrior monk, as a model for the future. And the first thing he did when 4-star General Bob Shoemaker became Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, first thing he did was he organized Task Force Delta as a conference to draw up an organizational plan for training all of the leaders in the U.S. military under 1st Earth Battalion auspice. And this was presented to the General Staff, and they thought it was great. How can that be possible? Well, one reason why, aside from him, there was another 4-star general, Glenn K. Otis. Then there were 6 major generals, Sam Wetzel, Dale Vesser, Bob Moore, Jack Merritt, James Ellis, Bob Elton. There were 3 brigadier generals. There were Alan Omo, Hardin Olson, and Rick Brown. Just with that kind of brass, everything that they wanted to get done got done, much to the detriment of the military, much to the detriment of the security of the United States. So what do these satellites do? What does the Son of the Morning Star do that is so bad that makes it such a great thing to them? Well, one of the things that it does is it channels and directs, in a physics sense, not in an occult sense, channels and directs microwave energy being pulsed from HAARP. And when I originally had to work with investigating HAARP, because that was one of the things that was done after the Presidio child abuse scandal, was I was sent off base and told that I would get a higher security clearance if I could find out what HAARP was all about. And HAARP, by the way, stands for High Frequency Activated Auroral Atmospheric Resonance Research Projection Program. A lot more complicated than what people think. So when I was investigating HAARP, I was told to go to Sonoma State, and they said there's this thing called Project Censored, which is still in business today. If you go to Sonoma State, that course is ongoing. It's there for journalism majors to teach them investigative journalism and bring out the best in them. So who funds Project Censored? People like Ted Koppel, John McLaughlin, big names in the industry fund Project Censored at Sonoma State University. And their job is to find out underreported stories and break them. So they said, Dietrich, we want you to find out what these journalism students are finding out about what we're doing. So when I was infiltrating Project Censored as a Sonoma State student for a year, I found out that HAARP was about basically channeling a steady pulsation from the Gakona, Alaska region to the North Korean peninsula with a chain of lucifers. And by doing that, they managed to deplete all of the mineral content out of North Korean soil, so they suffered from a 15-year drought. This 15-year drought has, since that time, resulted in over 1 million North Koreans dead. Any crab fisherman, any fishery in Gakona, Alaska will tell you every once in a while they'll find broken fragments of Scud missiles because the North Koreans try to launch Scud missiles to take down HAARP. And they can't get through because the HAARP EMP is so powerful, it's its own defense mechanism, and it scrambles the electronic brains and circuitry of these Scud missiles, and they explode in midair before they can even reach the facility. Alaska is under attack, and Alaskans don't know it. And it's under attack because it's essentially the launching pad for genocide. Now, this is kind of brings it closer to home. One of the things that I asked in terms of getting back to Colonel Aquino, when I came back from Sonoma State, by the way, the US government shafted me on all my student loans, and I never got that security clearance. So when I got back and I was talking to Lieutenant Colonel Aquino, and I was asking him, well, what was that all about? And he said, well, we had to get you off base after what had happened. And that was the Presidio child abuse scandal where I managed to save the colonel's ass because quite legally and quite realistically, Colonel Aquino had nothing to do with child molestation on the Presidio military base, certainly not physically. And I know that for a fact because it was my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright. And Gary Willard Hambright, I helped to get him arrested. Go into that story in a moment. That was all proven in court. He ultimately died of AIDS while on trial, but too late for 500,000 kids who he had infected with AIDS. But they had basically pointed to Colonel Aquino. And Colonel Aquino was never physically anywhere near the sites where the children were being molested. I was able to verify that and prove it. The devil's gratitude is nothing to be taken lightly, but of course he always felt so gracious to me after that. He wanted me to be on his team. So one time he took me down to Santa Fe, New Mexico to see the 1st Earth Battalion in action. And instead of a reveille where these guys are waking up to a bugle, these guys are waking up to primal scream. And then they do yoga. And then after that, they get on and put on the war paint, and they put on the feathers, and they do these chants and these seances and all this other crap. And I've got a quote here from one of them, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. This is like a quote from Colonel Mike Maloney, Colonel, one of the tribal elders of the 1st Earth Battalion. Now, this was in Task Force Delta's 1982 meeting at the U.S. Army War College. He repeated the theme of what goes on at the Santa Fe, New Mexico monastery, where I had the misfortune of having to spend a few nights. He said, "I am one of the tribal elders. My name is the Mullet Man. I am known as the one who casts nets. And I try to tell people of all those who cast nets, most should be concerned with the catching. Be careful what you catch. But some, at least, should focus more on the casting than the catching. I live with, fish for, and push the cause of the mullet, because he is a low-class fish. He is simple. He is honest. He moves around in great formations and columns. He does all the work, but he is also noble. He is, in many ways, like another noble thing that I once loved and worked with, called soldier." He got a standing ovation for this drug-addled drivel. So anyone who doubts what your officers are doing in terms of why your troops are getting killed in Afghanistan, why your troops are getting killed in Iraq, look on this and think of the Mullet Man, and think of your leadership, and shudder when you sleep at night. So I was over there in Santa Fe, and I had the dubious honor of meeting Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon. So he's explaining to me while I'm looking at all these guys going around in the sweat lodges and the war paint, on amphetamines, by the way. Speed them up. Ginseng tea, lots of ginseng tea. So he says, "We've got the rainbow warrior we're cultivating." And I said, "Does this have to do with don't ask, don't tell?" He said, No, you don't understand. See, the blacks, they give us soul. And the browns, they give us heart. And the reds, they give us grace. And the whites, they give us vision. And the yellows, they give us balance. So I turned to Colonel Aquino, I said, "Well, you know, my mom's half Chinese, half Japanese, and my dad, he's half German and half Irish. What do you expect me to bring to this?" He says, "Well, I was hoping you could bring some brains." So this is the kind of what we're working with. But to get back to the ugliness, the seriousness, Presidio military base. This is a skinned dog. Its sexual organs have been removed. I can guarantee you all its blood has been removed. Letterman Army Medical Center again, because it takes medical equipment to do that. And I can guarantee you, this isn't the BS given to you by Ron Johnson and these other guys talking about the men who stare at goats. One of the theses behind that occult film, which just turns everything into a big joke, is, hey, you know, dogs, they're man's best friend. The soldiers couldn't bear to kill them. Oh, that's why we had to turn to its goats, because they look kind of like the devil. Well, as the totemic animal of the dark forces, of Baal and Baphomet and Satyr and Pan and all of the divinities which were worshipped by the officer class of the Presidio military base, I can guarantee you there wasn't a single goat killed in the Presidio military base. They were killing dogs by the thousands. They were testing machine guns. They were testing sonic waves. They were testing microwaves. They were blowing them up with poison bullets, explosive bullets, everything you can imagine. That was dog killing central. And people were protesting. There were many people trying to block any entrance to the Presidio military base, what was going on at Letterman Army Medical Center. Well, this is some of the results. And believe me when I tell you, Colonel Aquino was insistent. Every single one of these is a sacrifice. None of these goes wasted. This is just wax. This was used in a ceremonial ritual so that they could direct their powers against the hands that offended them. I remember a ritual that was taking place in the library at one time where I was destroying documents. I always had the night shift. I've worked night shift all of my life. And I was responsible for document destruction on the base of San Francisco. I destroyed literally thousands and thousands of documents, far more than I could count. And our incinerator was vast. You could fit a person into it. And that's exactly what fell into it at one point, 10 years before I worked there. A guy who was pig-faced drunk fell in, burned an enormous part of his body, 75 to 90%. Well, he died. And one of the reasons he caught on fire so easily was because his uniform was saturated in alcohol. Well, mine never was. And it was dirty work, it's degrading work. They made me work the ovens. Well, Kino loved to do the rituals while I was working the ovens because I made the environment of the library feel like it was hell. Because the temperature went way up and it made it conducive to what he was summoning. And I can tell you for a fact, one time, something that he summoned, I used to always laugh when I was a kid at the Ten Commandments because I hated that cheesy scene where Moses calls on the angel of death and everything on the screen has this little black amoeba that's coming over everything and it's just blacking out all of the whatever you can see. And everybody's firstborn son is being left dead. And I kept saying to myself, what crappy special effects. But what I can tell you is when he and his 12 officers were summoning the angel of death so they could point it with this hand, this wax hand as a focus, what I can guarantee you is what I saw was that his voice amplified and became the voice of 12 men. And the voices of those 12 men became the one voice of Colonel Aquino. They exchanged voices. And I saw this happen before it went dark. And people would ask me when I described this, do you mean the lights went out? Do you mean they didn't? I said, no, the lights didn't go dim. It went black. I just mean something black entered that room, entered the library, and the lights could not penetrate it. I don't know if you can understand the horror of having that happen and then in the dark hearing 12 men's voices issue from one man and one man's voice issuing from 12. But that's nothing. This is one of the prisoners, a result from the Letterman Army Medical Center. He died screaming. His records disappeared. I worked with personnel records with Letterman Army Medical Center because I had to make sure no personnel records went into the Department of Defense library, the main post library where you kept unit records. Where you kept unit records, you didn't want unit records going into personnel records. These are photos that I took myself with a black and white camera that I had left over from my criminal science days back at City College of San Francisco. And I learned criminal photography technique in my criminology courses, just like Anton LaVey did. Anton LaVey, the head of the Church of Satan, his original career for a while in San Francisco was forensic photography. So I knew how to sneak this out. But this is not wax. This is a correct summoning pentagram. The circle is closed. The lines are defined because it's something I took a long time ago with a black and white photographic camera that I could hide. It looks like hell, to use a pun. In terms of its ritualism, it's sound. One time, probably the worst experience I ever had in my life was when his 12 officers of his coven came without him, without adult supervision, so to speak. And they decided they were going to perform a ritual using a circle to summon something that would give them the ability to fire in the dark. These guys had M16s. Just to explain this to all of you, the modern M16, this knockoff, this piece of crap that's issued to your troops, what I used when I was a Marine, M16A1 Armalite assault rifle, is a Mott block plastic piece of crap. And it is worthless. As soon as you can, if you manage to find an AK-47 off of anyone who's dead, you grab that and you throw your M16 away. But the point was, how did we wind up with that? Was because in Vietnam, the original M16 rifle still had a kick. And geniuses like McNamara said, hey, the average Vietnamese soldier is too small to take that kick. We've got to make something that provides no kick. So the original M16s, which had wooden stocks, were all shelved. And they wound up at storage facilities like the ammo depot at the Presidio military base. These were at least usable weapons. They were meant to work. But after McNamara got through with his defense contractors, He did indeed, this is not urban legend, because I burned the records concerning it. He contracted Mattel Toys to make a toy rifle for the Vietnamese. And it works in the sense that you can hold an M16 rifle butt up to your nose and fire it full auto, and your nose will feel nothing. There is no kick. And the damage coming out of the other end is equally minimal, I assure you. If you get hit, if you have the luck of hitting somebody's ribs, it'll probably bounce off. So they grabbed a bunch of the wooden stocked M16s, and they were experimenting with full auto flash suppressors and silencers. A silencer is a disposable instrument. You use it once, and you throw it away. An assassin, a hitman in a major urban area, it makes a sound like, which is nothing. In a major city, anybody hears in an alley. Nobody even bats an eye. But you use it, you throw it away. Silencer is one use. Full auto silencer is also disposable, has a slower rate of decay, so it chortles. So they had all of these experimental full auto silencers they wanted to test. So they didn't want people to see them in the daytime with this joy firing on the range. So, and by the way, what is a range in the Presidio military base? There is no range on the Presidio military base. Even the San Francisco Police Department has its own firing range. The military doesn't, not at the Presidio. So they use the playground. Well, there's nobody there at night at the playground. It's nighttime, I'm on night shift. These guys are gonna test these silencers. So what they do, they got a bunch of these life-size, childlike paramedic dolls that are used to practice child CPR on. And they strung them up on the swings. And they're at the other end of the Presidio Park, and they're saying, well, we can't hit these at night, so we'll call on an entity from this circle that'll imbue the weapons with power so we can hit them. So they like scratched with their blades, their bayonets, these pentagrams onto the wooden butts of their rifles to match the pentagram that you see up there. And they each performed a blood sacrifice, a ritual using some of their own blood. They were probably pig-faced drunk, so probably a lot more blood came out than they wanted. And so they used that to blood the pentagram. Well, you couldn't hear them because it was silent, but I knew what they were doing, and I couldn't do anything to stop them. They're officers. But anyhow, they're chortling happily away, blowing away these little child CPR dolls hung up on swings, just ripping them to shreds at night. Physically impossible to hit that at that range, but they were doing it. And suddenly, while I'm working with the incinerator, I felt cold. If you ever worked with an incinerator like I have, you're covered in black soot, you're hot, you're sweating, it's unbearable for most people. You build up a tolerance. But suddenly, I'm working with this, and I went cold. And it's not just cold in the air. Everything inside me, I lost all empathy. It's like any sense of warmth, any sense of love I had for my mother and my father, or petting a kitten, or touching anybody. All of that was gone. I didn't feel anything. And I knew something had gone terribly, terribly wrong, cosmically wrong. And I went outside, and I went past these 12 officers who are firing full auto in the dark. And this is what I found. The circle's not closed. The circle's broken. Something's broken through. And I turned back and I looked at them, and all of their eyes were glowing. 12 men in full uniform in the dark, every single one of them with glowing eyes. Every single one of them had their M16s pointed at me. And I wasn't afraid because I wasn't feeling anything. I didn't feel anything. And when I turned around, they said, well, if we kill you, then maybe it'll be satisfied and go back. And I said, no, you don't understand. That'll feed it. And I said, you really have to come with me so we can fix this. Don't you feel it? And I don't think they ever felt anything because they don't feel anything when it's missing. And so I said, something's terribly wrong, and if you kill me, your careers will be impacted. And that stopped them. Then they put their guns down, and they're still looking at me with these glowing eyes, and they said, but it works so well, our weapons are firing so well, we're hitting everything in the dark. I said, it's not the weapons, it's you. It's inside of you. And so I said, get back into the library, we're gonna find something. Now, I'm born in Asia, I am not a Christian. And I said, we've got to do something to revoke this. And they said, you believe in all this crap, why don't you call something up to put it back? And I said, it's not like that. There's 12 of you and there's one of me. We have to go old school. We're going to find a Bible. We tore that place inside out. Presidio Military Base Library. There was no Bible. And I said, find a Book of Mormon. Find something. And there's no Book of Mormon. There's nothing. There is nothing that was holy in that library. And I said, the children's room. We got to go to the children's room. We went to the children's room. And there was this little child's Bible where Jesus is smiling like a toothpaste commercial. And I said, just do what I'm doing. And I got down and just said the Lord's Prayer. That's the only thing I knew because my dad was a Catholic. He was Caucasian, and he was Catholic. So I just said, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And it was just so hard. And we couldn't get it out. I said, cross the pentagrams off the butts of your rifles. Draw a cross. Scrape off the pentagram. And they couldn't do it. They just trying, and they couldn't even move. It's like they're underwater. And then I'm grabbing it, and I'm helping them, and we're just scraping. We're on our knees, and we're just straining with every effort, every fiber of our being. And we're finally able to do this with 12 buttstocks. We get these pentagrams scraped off. We get these little crucifixes back on, these real crude crucifixes. And we start going back to the Lord's Prayer again. And I'm just saying, forgive us, we lost children, forgive us, forgive us, forgive us. And we're just going through this, and it's just so hard. It's like we were going to vomit. It's just, everything just felt so horrible. It was just something was like cotton was in our mouths. It was like we literally could not talk. And then finally, after doing this 100 times, something left us. And whatever it was that left us, it was so vast, I know it took something with it, like some kind of tumorous cancer that you have to remove a bit of the organ with. And I know that day I lost something. And I have no idea what it was. I don't know what it was because I can't remember it. I think it was a happy memory. Something, some empathic moment, some happy memory was taken from me with that entity leaving that I will never retrieve. And we all fell on the floor, just exhausted, just collapsed, just sweating profusely. Some of the guys started vomiting, and I myself thought I was going to vomit. I was just dry heaving. And it was just after that incident that I said, get the rifles back in the ammo dump so no one knows what happened. And even though people found that, this is the tragedy of the Presidio Military Base, they found that the next day, that was so common, it didn't mean anything. Kids went to play in that playground the next day and had seen stuff like that so often, nobody questioned it. What I began to realize is that magic is a technique. And what it takes is enough belief from enough people to harness it. This is Colonel Aquino now. He's retired with his wife Lilith. And one of the reasons he was able to reach this happy state was thanks to my saving his butt when it came to the child molestation scandal at the Presidio Military Base, which I'm going to try to get into right now and cover as quickly as possible. It's very hard to cover. It's very gruesome to cover. But what had happened was that when I started working at the Presidio Military Base in 1984, at the ripe old age of about 17 years of age, I was a librarian's aide. And eventually what I became was a full-blown military reference technician. At that time, my high school teacher, Gary Hambright, who taught at John O'Connell Vocational Institute of Technology. It was a vocational school, not a high school, but it took up a person's high school years. It was renowned all over the world as San Quentin Prep. At that point, it was so full of gangs and violent teachers as well that there's practically no one who ever gave it any credit. No one was ever hired. In other words, the job of a vocational school is to get you employed as soon as you graduate. No one was ever employed graduating from John O'Connell. I was there majoring in commercial illustration. And when I majored in commercial illustration, it opened up a lot of doors for me because I did some cartoons for the Star Presidian, the military-based newspaper. I was invited on the basis of that to San Francisco's the city of consulates to work for the Iraqi consulate before they were considered America's enemies. I actually spent some time in Iraq doing propaganda posters for the Saddam Hussein regime when he was our ally during the Iran-Iraq war. I write about that on my website, the story behind that. Of course, all the kids who put it up for me for free, you get what you pay for. They were all doing bong rips. They spell Iraqi like it's an Indian tribe, but you're free to read about that story later on at douglasdietrich.com. But the point is, my high school teacher from there, who was a full-blown pedophile, he was a sworn, ordained Southern Baptist minister without a pulpit. It must be emphasized, he was without a pulpit. He lived in a church in San Francisco because he was essentially homeless, couldn't keep his child porn there, so he kept it at John O'Connell at the Vocational Institute on school property as art reference so that people could draw children. So he got away with that. To show you what John O'Connell was like, he got away with that for years. And then he ran the daycare center at the Presidio military base. 250 children were the maximum children's daycare center the Presidio military base could handle. That's an enormous amount of children. 250 children is enormous. But over many years, while Gary Hambright was working there, it dwindled down to 180 because children were getting so traumatized they couldn't return. Beyond that, they were coming home with every STD imaginable. They were coming down with chlamydia. They were coming down with venereal. They were coming down with herpes zoster. Worse yet, they came down with HIV. Everybody began to investigate. What happened at the investigation was it became a circus. You had the FBI, had the San Francisco Police Department, had the CID, the Criminal Investigations Division of the United States Army, of course, that was headquartered at Presidio, headed by the JAG. All of this was just leading nowhere. One reason it was leading nowhere was because they were pursuing the wrong man. They raided his home. As I said, he lives practically next door to me. The chief investigator of his case was Sergeant Sandy Gallant, Gallant. She was a specialist in satanic crime. She had dealt with occult crime in San Francisco before. She was familiar enough with the occult like voodoo santeria, where when a headless body was found in Golden Gate Park with a chicken's head stuck on top of it, she gave the exact date when someone would break into the morgue to try and reunite the missing head with the body, and she predicted right on the money. After that, she became nationally renowned as an investigator in satanic crime. And she was hot on Aquino. And she said, oh, we've got to stop that. And I told her, look, it's not Aquino. I said, it's Gary Hambright. He's got his child porn over there at the John O'Connell. They investigated. They found out it was true. And at that point, it became San Francisco Police Department jurisdiction. And they were able to kick out the FBI, the provost marshal of the Presidio military base and all that, go into Presidio, take Gary Hambright out in handcuffs. But they were waiting a few days before they jumped him. They didn't want to jump him on base. Wanted to jump him at home. So I saw that guy one last time taking the bus from the Presidio military base. So I got on the bus with him. I says, hey, here you lost your job over at the daycare center. He had no idea I'd fingered him. He said, I didn't lose my job, I quit. I said, well, what you gonna do now? He looked at me with this, he was drinking a bottle of grape juice. He looked at me with this big cheese-eating grin with all these purple teeth, and he said, you know, I really want to get into politics. That was the last time I ever saw him. Then later on, when he was on TV, on trial, a friend of mine said, he's in politics now, up to his ass. January 1990, he died of AIDS. And of course, it turned out all of these children had been infected with such. What the U.S. Army responded to was they burned the daycare center down and all of the records inside of it. This was a $50,000 arson. It took place on the autumnal equinox, September 22nd, 1987. The Community Services Building was adjacent to the Presidio Daycare Center. Right behind that was the Military Intelligence Building, where Colonel Aquino ran systems analysis for the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. And they were all connected by underground tunnel systems. And that's when the order came down to me, Dietrich, you burn those records of that tunnel system. And I burned them. The BATF got involved, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and they said it was arson. The U.S. Army simply denied it. And then what happened was the parents all got together before they were transferred all over the world, because this was in the days before the internet. And if it happened in the days of the internet, the entire U.S. Army would have suffered. They would have been deconstructed and reconstructed, which is what should have happened. But in the days before the internet, the U.S. Army took every single one of the impacted families and they transferred them to the four corners of the earth, to the Philippines. We still had Subic Bay open at that time, to Okinawa, to Guam, to Germany, to everywhere in the world. But before they were transferred to the four corners of the earth, all those families got together and they burned down the Army daycare center. And that was a $500,000 arson done by all of the parents involved together. That was 3 weeks after the original community services fire. So when that happened, the Army didn't arrest anyone, didn't blame anyone, just transferred them. And you never heard of it. But if you look it up, if you look up what I'm talking about, you'll find all of it is confirmed, including the fact that all of this was part of something bigger. November 1987, Army received alleged child abuse at 15 daycare centers and several elementary schools, 2 cases in the Air Force daycare center, another in the Navy. June 1988, a special team of experts were sent to Panama, where the military was buttressing the Panama Canal, had to investigate 10 daycare center attendees, children infected with AIDS. By the way, when my high school teacher, Gary Hambright, was convicted by a federal grand jury on October 1987 when he was indicted with 12 charges against children. Not one of them was over 4 years old. And the worst one was the chaplain's daughter. Whatever happened to her was so bad, she wound up withdrawn into a shell the rest of her life, and she never came out. But another person that all of these people brought up was, aside from Mr. Gary, as they called my high school teacher, was Mikey. Michael Aquino was always described physically perfectly, down to a T. But I can tell you physically, he was never there. I can account for that because he was stationed in Washington, D.C. during the 2 years that this was going on, because I had to serve as his liaison and handle all of his calls. He was not physically there, but they all described him. West Point is where this all kind of came to a culmination. June of 1984, a month before another case broke out at West Point, the child daycare center at the West Point Academy grounds is Building 666. In June 1984, a staff sergeant killed a 22-month-old child. He murdered her, and he got 18 months suspension and a dishonorable discharge, and he walked free because you can't sue the U.S. government. At that time, it was federally illegal, constitutionally. You could not sue the U.S. government. He got off scot-free. And after that, July 1984, a 3-year-old girl found herself in the emergency room of West Point Hospital with a lacerated vagina. 50 children came out, photographed, smeared in excrement, eating and drinking urine and feces. West Point Academy grounds fought all of the allegations. Many of the accusers, interestingly enough, were career military officers who didn't belong with the program. They weren't part of 1st Earth Battalion or Deltanet. This happened everywhere. Fort Dix, Fort Leavenworth, Fort Jackson. And at West Point itself, finally, Army Captain Walter R. Grote refused a promotion to major in June of 1985. And his quotation is, "I cannot accept promotion in a system that at first refused to acknowledge and now refuses to deal with the victims of extensive child abuse that occurred at the West Point Child Development Center." And after that, many other officers resigned in protest of what had happened to their children. Well, this is exactly what Aquino wanted. And one of the last things I heard from him was a phone call saying, "Dietrich, we won. We really beat him. There aren't any Christians left in the military anymore." Thank you. Thank you, all of you.